Working at St. Howard's Hospital in 1950 was an experience that oscillated between the exhausting routine and a constant, subtle discomfort that I couldn't explain. It was a small hospital, nestled in a rural area, with limited resources and a small staff. The nights, especially emergencies, were disturbing. The shadows grew longer than usual, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder, and the silences felt too heavy. There were rumors, like in all hospitals, stories of patients who disappeared, unexplained noises in the closed rooms, and one that always seemed the most absurd to me. A doctor who worked the night shift but that nobody knew. According to this story, the doctor would show up alone in the early morning, checking on patients in silence and disappearing before anyone could talk to him. At first, I dismissed the story as a joke or a myth to scare newbies. But the more I listened, the more disturbing details emerged. "He always wears an immaculate white coat," a nurse told me during a break, "but his eyes don't look human." Another added, "You never hear when he comes in or when he leaves, but he's always checking on patients who, the next day, get worse inexplicably." I didn't believe in ghosts, but the nights in St. Howard's were gloomy enough to make anything seem possible. It was 2 a.m. when it happened. I was organizing supplies in the emergency room, trying to keep myself busy to combat tiredness. It was a quiet night, with only a couple of patients resting on their gurneys. The only sound was the constant tick-tock of the clock on the wall and the soft murmur of a heart monitor. My back was to the entrance when I heard footsteps. They were soft but firm, the distinctive sound of leather-soled shoes on linoleum. I thought it would be the doctor on duty, although I knew that Dr. Harris, who was on shift that night, usually stayed in his office unless called. When I turned around, I saw a man. He was leaning over one of the gurneys, checking on one of the patients. He was tall, with a stiff posture and a white coat that looked almost new, too clean for the hospital environment. He wore a stethoscope around his neck, and although I couldn't see his face clearly, something in his presence seemed strange to me. "Do you need help, doctor?" I asked, getting closer. He didn't answer. He continued checking the patient, moving his hands in a precise and methodical manner. Something in his way of working was disturbing, as if he wasn't really there, as if he were a shadow repeating a movement learned a long time ago. "Doctor, can I assist you?" I insisted, my voice sounding firmer than I felt. Again, there was no answer. I stopped a few steps from him, unable to move any further. There was something in the air, a sudden cold that made my skin crawl. The man turned slightly, and it was then that I saw him. His eyes were completely black like two vacuum wells that did not reflect the light. His face was expressionless, but his lips curved just barely into a smile that didn't convey humanity. I instinctively stepped back, and before I could say anything else, he straightened up and began walking toward the exit. His steps were silent now, and although the hallway was long, he disappeared before I could follow him. I spent the rest of the night in a constant state of alert, checking the patients and trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe tiredness was playing tricks on me, but the next day, when I mentioned what had happened to Dr. Harris, his expression changed. "There was no other doctor here last night," he said in a serious tone. "Just me, and I didn't leave my office." I tried to insist, describing the man I had seen, but Harris shook his head. "It was no one on staff, and no one else can come in here without registering." His answer didn't calm me down. In fact, it made something inside me twist latently, something I couldn't ignore. The following days were torture. I convinced myself that what I had seen wasn't real, that it must have been a mix of tiredness and the influence of the stories that haunted the hospital. But the nights in emergencies began to change. Patients began to report strange things. "A doctor came to check on me," some described. "A tall man in a white coat." Others spoke of a figure leaning over them as they slept, muttering incomprehensible things. One night, while doing my rounds, I found one of the empty gurneys. The patient, an older man who was admitted for respiratory failure, was not in his bed. My first thought was that he had gotten up to go to the bathroom, but the bathroom was empty. I began to look for him down the hall, not understanding how. My heart was racing. I found him standing in a corner, facing the wall. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked him, approaching cautiously. He didn't answer. When I lightly touched him on the shoulder, he turned slowly. His eyes were open but empty, as if he didn't really see me. "The doctor told me to stay here," he murmured before collapsing. I tried to revive him, but he was already dead. That was the last night I worked at St. Howard's Hospital. I handed in my resignation the next day, unable to bear the thought of entering that emergency room again. But even now, years later, I can't forget the man in the white coat. In my worst nightmares, I see him standing over my bed, looking at me with those black eyes, waiting for something. And the most disturbing thing is that sometimes, in the middle of the night, I think I hear soft footsteps in the hallway outside my room. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. Working in a rural hospital had never seemed particularly scary to me. It was 1950, and although the old buildings and the long, lonely nights could be unsettling to some, I considered myself a practical person. The San Alvaro Hospital was far from modern. It was a set of dark brick wards connected by narrow, poorly lit hallways. The hospital had been built in the 1920s, and according to some, there were parts that were never finished remodeling after a fire that had occurred years before. But to me, those stories were just that, stories. Until one night, I discovered something that defied everything I believed possible. It was a quiet night, or as quiet as it can be in a hospital. The silence was broken only by the occasional beep of the monitors and the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. I was in charge of making rounds in the south wing, where the most stable patients were. It was a routine that I had done countless times, and although sometimes tiredness invaded me, I had never felt lost until that night. I had finished checking the rooms in the south wing and was heading back to the main area to take a break. I turned into a hallway that I thought I recognized. But as I walked forward, something didn't fit. The walls were darker than usual, as if the paint was worn away. The lamps flickered weakly, and the air had a musty smell mixed with a faint trace of something metallic. I didn't remember having seen that hallway before, but I assumed that perhaps I had taken a shortcut that I didn't remember. The hallway seemed to get longer with each step I took. The doors on the sides were all closed, and each one was identical, made of old wood with bronze plates that had no numbers or names. I passed by one of them and had to notice something strange. The knob was covered in dust, as if no one had touched that door in decades. I continued walking, feeling a growing discomfort. Something in the silence was different. It was no longer the typical silence of a hospital at night. It was denser, as if the hallway was absorbing all sound. I turned my head several times, sure that someone was behind me, but I saw nothing, only the endless hallway and the closed doors. Finally, I decided to return to where I had come from. But when I turned around, the hallway was not the same. The entrance through which I had arrived was gone, replaced by more doors and more shadows. I felt my breathing accelerate as I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn. Maybe fatigue was playing with my mind. But I couldn't deny the cold that was beginning to filter into my bones. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks, and my heart seemed to stop too. It was a slow, heavy rhythm, as if someone was walking slowly toward me. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. The doors were still closed, the shadows motionless. However, the footsteps continued. They were not an echo of mine. They were different, firm, advancing with calm. "Hello!" I tried to call, my voice barely a whisper that was lost in the air. There was no answer, only the sound of footsteps getting closer. I quickened my walk, trying to find the end of the hallway, but it seemed to extend infinitely. The doors passed by me, each one identical to the last, and the air felt heavier with each step I took. The lamps flickered more frequently, and at one moment, the light went out completely. The darkness was total. I couldn't even see my own hands in front of me. I stood still, afraid to move and find something I didn't want to see. The footsteps stopped too, but now there was something else. A low and guttural whisper, as if someone was speaking a language I couldn't understand. It came from everywhere, echoing off the walls and inside my head. I turned on the flashlight I had in my pocket, and the beam of light illuminated the hallway in front of me. But something was wrong. The doors were open now, all at once, and behind each one, there were no rooms. There was darkness, a black and unfathomable void that seemed to move, writhe, as if it were alive. I stepped back, feeling panic take over me. I wanted to scream, run, do something, but my legs wouldn't respond. Then I saw him, at the end of the hallway, where the light from my flashlight barely reached. A figure was moving. It was tall and thin, too tall to be human, and it was slowly advancing toward me. Its walk was unnatural, with twisted limbs, and each step was accompanied by a wet and heavy sound. I didn't wait any longer. I ran in the opposite direction, without caring if it was forward or backward. I just wanted to escape. The doors were still open, and the whisper became a chorus, voices that rose in a sharp and deafening scream. The hallway seemed to tilt, as if the ground was moving under my feet. I kept running, my flashlight swinging in my hand. Finally, I saw a brighter light in front of me. It was different than the flickering lights in the hallway. It was clear, warm, like the exit of the hospital. I ran toward it with all my strength, and when I crossed it, I fell to the ground. When I looked up, I was in the main area of the hospital. Everything was as always, the nurses working, the patients resting. I looked behind me, but the hallway I had come out through was not there. There was only a white wall with no doors or windows. I tried to explain to a partner what had happened, but she looked at me in disbelief. "That hallway does not exist," she said. "That part of the hospital was closed years ago after the fire. It is walled up." But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. And although I never found that hallway again, the nights in the hospital were never the same. Every time I walked alone, I felt a presence, a shadow at the edge of my vision. And in the moments of absolute silence, I can still hear those footsteps, following me, waiting for me to get lost again. Working in the hospital during the night shifts always had its peculiarities. The dark hallways, the echo of footsteps, and the constant sound of heart monitors created an environment that could be as comforting as it was disturbing. I had learned to ignore the ghost stories that circulated among the staff. I thought they were just attempts to kill boredom on long and lonely nights. But there was one night that completely changed my perception. A night that still haunts me. The monitoring room of the hospital was a strange place. It was in a secluded wing, designed to monitor the most critical patients. A series of screens showed the readings from the monitors, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration. It was the mechanical heart of the hospital, a place where the sounds of beeping could be both reassuring and terrifying. I spent a good part of my shifts there, monitoring the patient's vitals, making sure nothing got out of control. It was a quiet night, or at least it seemed that way at first. The monitors made their regular beeps, marking the heartbeats and breathing of the connected patients. I was reviewing a chart when one of the monitors began to make a different sound. A rhythmic beep, louder like a heartbeat. I looked at the screen, expecting to see a patient's chart. But what I found was something I couldn't explain. The screen showed a perfect tracing of a heart rhythm, regular, steady beats. But the problem was that machine wasn't connected to anyone. The monitor was in a corner of the room, turned off, or at least it should have been. I walked over, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe someone had forgotten to turn it off after disconnecting a patient. But when I checked the wires, they were hanging, disconnected. The monitor was completely isolated and still showed a perfect heart rate. A chill ran down my spine. I took a deep breath, telling myself it must be some kind of technical fault. I called the maintenance technician, an older man named Henry, who had worked at the hospital for more years than I could remember. When he arrived, he checked the monitor with a calm that contrasted with my growing uneasiness. "This isn't the first time this has happened," he said finally, without taking his eyes off the screen. His tone was casual, almost resigned. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling my skin crawl. Henry sighed and turned to me. "That machine always does this on this date. Years ago, a patient died connected to it. His heart stopped beating here, in this very room. Since then, every year on the anniversary of his death, this machine records activity, as if his heart was still here. I froze. I wanted to laugh, to tell him that he was making a fool of himself, but something in his expression stopped me. He wasn't joking. Who was the patient? I managed to ask. Henry shrugged. A young man, I think. I never did too much research. I just know that that machine is marked. That night, I tried to ignore what had happened, but it was impossible. Every time I got closer to the monitoring room, I felt a chill run through me. The lights seemed dimmer, the sounds higher pitched, and worst of all was the monitor. Even after Henry unplugged it completely, it still showed a heart rate for a few seconds before shutting off. The next few nights were no better. The monitors began to flicker for no apparent reason. Irregular beats filled the rooms, as if something invisible was interfering with the machines. I began to feel like I wasn't alone, even when the rest of the staff was in another part of the hospital. One night, as I was reviewing the charts, I heard a different sound. It wasn't a beep this time. It was a barely audible whisper, but enough to stop me dead in my tracks. It came from the corner where the cursed monitor was. I walked closer, trying to convince myself that it was my imagination. But then the monitor came on. The screen glowed a greenish hue, and the heart rate tracing appeared again. This time, the beats were faster, as if something was excited or anxious. I felt a knot in my stomach as the whispering grew clearer. They weren't words, but there was something in the tone that made me desperate. I tried to turn the machine off, but the button didn't respond. Suddenly, the beeping of the monitor stopped, and the screen showed something I'll never forget. It wasn't a tracing this time. It was a number, a date. The date of the next day. Couldn't sleep that night. Henry's words and the monitor's behavior filled my mind. It was a warning, a reminder. I tried to look up information on the patient who had died hooked up to the machine, but the records were sparse. All I found was a man, Thomas Grant, who had died of cardiac arrest after a car accident. He was barely 27 years old. The next day passed in a fog of anxiety. I tried to concentrate on my work, but every time I passed by the monitoring room, I felt like something was watching me. Finally, when the clock struck 2 a.m., the monitor began to beep again. This time, the rhythm was erratic, as if the heart it was recording was desperately fighting to keep going. I slowly approached, fear fighting my curiosity. And then I saw it. A figure was standing on the other side of the room. It was blurry, almost translucent, but clear enough to make out the features. A young man with a pale face and sunken eyes was staring at me with an expression of sadness. And something else, something I couldn't decipher. Before I could move or scream, it disappeared. The monitor gave a final beep, and the screen went black. Since that night, I avoided the monitoring room whenever I could. But the memory of the cursed monitor and the man who accompanied it never left me. On the quieter days, I could still hear the echo of the beeps and feel the presence of something that did not belong to this world. And every year, on the same date, I know that the machine will turn back on. Because even though Thomas's heart left long ago, it seems that something about him never left that place. In 1950, I took a job as a housekeeping aide at St. Mark's Hospital, an old, gloomy building that had survived decades of neglect and tragedies. It was my first steady job, and although it wasn't the most glamorous, it allowed me to stay afloat in difficult times. The hospital was a strange place, full of whispers and legends, but I always thought they were stories to scare newbies, until I came across room 308. From the first day, I noticed there was something peculiar about that room. It was in the oldest wing of the hospital, right at the end of a hallway that always seemed darker than the others. The lights flickered constantly, and the air was colder, as if that section was separate from the rest of the building. No one spoke directly of room 308, but patients and staff avoided looking at it, as if its mere existence was a threat. One of the nurses, an older woman named Mrs. Grayson, warned me once, "Don't go near that door, girl. That room is..." She didn't finish the sentence, but her tone was enough to make me uneasy. At first, I laughed nervously, thinking she was trying to scare me. But with time, I noticed that no one cleaned that room, and the stories began to accumulate. They said that the patients who were admitted there did not survive more than 3 days. It didn't matter if they had arrived for a fracture or a minor illness. Something in that room seemed to absorb their life. Some employees claimed to have heard screams coming from inside, although it was always empty. Others spoke of shadows that moved behind the windows, even when the blinds were closed. I was skeptical. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but everything changed one night during one of my loneliest shifts. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was cleaning the hallway of the old wing. The hospital was silent, except for the monotonous hum of the fluorescent lamps. As I passed in front of the door of room 308, I heard a sound. It was faint but unmistakable, a dull thud. I stopped, thinking that perhaps someone had made a mistake and had entered the room by mistake. But when I looked through the small window of the door, I saw no one. The thud continued, a low, heartbreaking lament that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I felt a chill run through me but decided to investigate. Maybe it was a forgotten radio or some mechanical noise. With trembling hands, I pulled the handle. The door opened with a long, high-pitched screech, and the air inside the room was frigid, as if I had just stepped into a freezer. The room was empty, just as I expected. There were no beds or medical equipment, just a desolate space with peeling walls and a floor covered in dust. But something else caught my attention. The walls were covered in marks. They were handprints, hundreds of them, as if someone had desperately scratched the plaster, trying to escape. Some were small, like a child's, while others were larger, with fingers spread out in unnatural positions. I moved closer to inspect them and noticed that some marks were fresh, as if they had been made just a few minutes ago. A chill ran down my spine, but before I could react, the door behind me slammed shut. The sound echoed in the small space, and I stood still with my heart pounding. I tried to turn the handle, but it was stuck. I started pounding on the door, screaming for help, but no one answered. That's when I heard it. It was a low, fragmented whisper, like someone was talking right behind me. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was desperate, filled with pain. I turned slowly and saw something that made me back up until I knocked on the door. A figure was standing in the darkest corner of the room. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs that ended in twisted fingers. Its face was partially covered in shadows, but I could make out the eyes, 2 black pools that seemed to absorb all the light. It didn't move, but its mere presence filled the space with a feeling of oppression. The whispering grew, turning into a chorus of voices. It was as if the room was alive, and every mark on the walls belonged to someone who had been trapped there. I closed my eyes tightly, praying for it all to end, but the cold kept enveloping me, and the voices grew louder. Finally, the door opened. I don't know how it happened, but I fell to the floor of the hallway, gasping and shaking. When I looked back, the room was in complete darkness, and the thudding had stopped. I got up and ran without stopping until I reached the main room. I tried to tell Mrs. Grayson what had happened, but she looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. "I warned you," she said in a low voice. "That room is not for the living." That same night, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't bear the thought of returning to that place, of walking down that hallway again and feeling the weight of those marks on the walls. But even after leaving the hospital, the nightmares continued. In my dreams, I'm trapped in room 308, and the walls begin to close in around me. The hand marks multiply, and the voices fill my mind until I can't think anymore. And always, at the last moment, I see that figure in the corner, watching me with those empty eyes. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I swear I hear a thudding coming from the street, as if, somehow, room 308 never really let me go. I worked as a night nurse at St. Andrew's Hospital, an old building that stood like a dark giant among windswept hills. The hospital had a reputation for being a place where the border between life and death seemed thinner, a perception fueled by the stories of generations of patients and employees. For me, all that was exaggeration. hallway rumors to kill the boredom of long nights. Until something happened that made me question not only my sanity but the very nature of reality. It was a stormy night. One of those where the sky seems to fall apart and the wind howls like a wounded animal. The lightning intermittently illuminated the hospital hallways, and the rumble of thunder made the windows vibrate. There were few patients in the emergency room and everything was quiet, almost too quiet. Then, I heard the creaking of the wheels of a stretcher and the hurried sound of footsteps in the hallway. I left the station to find 2 orderlies pushing a stretcher toward one of the emergency rooms. On it, a man was lying, covered in blood. His face was pale, and his half-open eyes reflected a mixture of terror and resignation. His clothes were torn, and the wounds on his body were deep, as if he had been attacked with an inhuman fury. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my composure. "Accident," said one of the orderlies without stopping. "We found him near the road. Someone called the hospital. He seems serious." I nodded and followed the orderlies to the emergency room. The doctor on duty, Dr. Clay, arrived quickly, and we began to work on the man. His wounds were terrible, deep cuts on the torso, as if something had torn him with gigantic claws. His pulse was weak, and the blood continued to flow despite our efforts to stop it. While we tried to save him, the man opened his eyes and looked directly at me. His gaze was intense, as if he was trying to say something he couldn't articulate. His lips moved weakly, but no sound came out of them. I tried to calm him down, assuring him that we were doing everything possible. But deep down, I knew he wouldn't survive. He died a few minutes later, his last breath escaping in an almost inaudible sigh. After covering his body with a sheet, I began to fill out the corresponding report. But when I searched the records to write down his admission, I found something strange. There was nothing, not a name or a record of his arrival. I asked the orderlies who had brought him in, but they were nowhere to be found. Confusion began to set in my mind, but I assumed it was a clerical error. With the storm and chaos, it wouldn't be unusual for someone to have forgotten to log the details. I decided to talk to Dr. Clay, but when I mentioned the man, he looked at me with a frown. "What patient are you talking about?" he asked. "The man who came in an hour ago, the one who died in the emergency room. We were trying to stabilize him together," I answered, feeling my voice shake. The doctor shook his head. "No patients have come in tonight. It's been a quiet night." For a moment, I thought he was playing a joke on me, but his expression was one of genuine confusion. I took him to the emergency room, but to my horror, the gurney was empty. There was no sign of the man or the sheet we had used to cover his body. It was as if he had never been there. I tried to talk to some other coworkers, but no one remembered seeing the man. The orderlies who had brought him in seemed to not exist. When I asked about them, they told me that there had been no patients that night, no extra staff in the emergency room. My mind began to fill with doubt, and for the first time I felt real fear. A fear that was beyond what I could comprehend. That night, as I tried to continue my shift, something else strange happened. In the break room, I found a drop of blood on the floor. It was small but fresh, as if someone had bled there just minutes ago. I followed the trail, which stretched into one of the darkest hallways in the hospital. A wing that had been closed off years ago after a fire. Each step I took felt heavier, and the silence was deafening. When I got to the end of the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man's gurney was there, with the sheet still covering the body. But as I got closer, I saw that the sheet was empty. Only the blood marks remained where his body had been. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the silence. A low whisper, barely audible but clearly coming from the gurney. I stepped back, feeling the air around me grow colder. The lights in the hallway began to flicker, and in a flash, I saw a figure at the end of the hall. It was the man. He was standing, staring at me with the same terror-filled eyes that I had seen before he died. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The figure took a step toward me and then another. Its movement was slow but inexorable. Each step echoed down the hall, an echo that seemed to come from everywhere. I closed my eyes tightly, praying for it to go away. When I opened them, the hall was empty. The gurney was gone, and with it, any trace of the man. That was my last night at St. Andrew's Hospital. I quit the next day, unable to bear the weight of what I had experienced. But even after leaving the hospital, I have not been able to forget the man. Sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the wind blows hard, I can hear his slow, heavy footsteps, as if he were searching for me. And in those moments, I can't help but wonder, who was he, really? And why was I the only one who remembered him? Ever since I started working at the hospital, I had heard stories about the wheelchair in the old wing. People talked about how it moved on its own through the night, gliding through the deserted hallways, and the dry, squeaky wheels that could be heard in the early morning. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I thought they were just stories to scare new employees. But I soon realized that there was more truth to those stories than I was willing to accept. The hospital where I worked was several decades old. The walls had witnessed countless tragedies and miracles, and the hallways had housed both life and death. There was a heavy atmosphere in the air, as if the place itself breathed the suffering of its patients. The wheelchair in question belonged to one of the less traveled sections of the hospital, a part that was now only used in emergency cases or when the other areas were too crowded. My first few weeks were pretty normal. I got used to the long shifts and the routine of the hospital. However, things began to change when I was assigned to the night shift in the old wing. It was during one of those nights that I had my first encounter with the wheelchair. It was 3 a.m, and the hospital was silent. Only the constant humming of monitors and the soft beeping of machines broke the stillness. I was reviewing patient records when I heard a strange sound. It was a squeaking sound, like something metallic was dragging across the floor. At first, I thought it was some patient trying to move on their own, so I got up and headed down the hall. What I saw froze me. The wheelchair was at the end of the hall, moving slowly toward me. There was no one pushing it, and there was no logical reason for it to move. I stood alone, paralyzed, unable to take my eyes off that slowly moving chair. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe there was a slope in the floor that I hadn't noticed before, or maybe the floor wasn't level. However, none of that could explain the precise and constant movement of the chair. When the chair stopped a few feet away from me, I felt a chill run down my spine. I slowly backed away without taking my eyes off the chair and returned to the nurse's station. I tried to concentrate on my work, but I couldn't get out of my head what I had seen. That night, when the nurse arrived, I left the hospital feeling more tired and disturbed than usual. As the days went by, my encounters with the wheelchair became more frequent. It always seemed to move when no one was looking, and it always seemed to be in a different place every time I found it. The other employees also started talking about the chair. Some said it had belonged to a patient who had died waiting for an operation that never came. Others claimed it was simply a practical joke by some coworker. But the more I investigated, the more I began to believe there was something much more sinister about that chair. I began to look up information about the patient who had supposedly used the chair. I found his file in the old hospital archives. He had been an elderly man admitted for heart surgery. His condition had worsened while awaiting surgery, and he had died in his room one night, alone and forgotten. The wheelchair had been his only company in his final days. One night, I decided to stay in the old wing after my shift. I wanted to see the wheelchair up close to understand what made it move. I brought a camera to document any unusual activity. I prepared myself for a long night of waiting. I settled into one of the chairs in the hallway and kept my eyes fixed on the wheelchair at the end of the hall. The hours passed slowly, and the hospital was eerily quiet. Every now and then, I would hear the soft whisper of the wind outside or the distant sound of some monitor in another part of the building. Just when I was beginning to think that nothing was going to happen, I heard the familiar squeak of the wheelchair. I turned on the camera and focused toward the end of the hall. The chair was there, moving slowly toward me. I watched through the lens of the camera, trying to capture every detail. There was no one around, no visible force that could be moving the chair. It stopped right in front of me, as if it knew I was watching it. I felt a cold presence around me, a feeling that I was not alone. I decided to move closer. My heart was pounding as I took each step, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. When I was just a few inches from the chair, I could see that it was in perfect condition. I leaned down and touched one of the wheels. It was cold, much colder than it should have been. Suddenly, I felt a blast of freezing air, and the chair moved sharply toward me, causing me to fall backward. I jumped up, fear flooding my veins. I ran out of the old wing without looking back. That night, I barely slept, tormented by the image of the chair moving on its own. The next morning, I decided to speak to one of the oldest doctors in the hospital. I told him what I had seen and asked him if he knew anything about the wheelchair. He looked at me with a serious expression and told me that there were rumors, but he had never paid much attention to the stories. However, he suggested I speak to a nurse who had worked at the hospital for many years and might know more. When I found the nurse, she greeted me with a kind smile. I explained what had happened, and her face turned serious. She told me that she had worked at the hospital for over 3 decades and had seen many strange things, but nothing as disturbing as the wheelchair. She explained that the patient who had used the wheelchair had been a lonely man with no family or friends to visit him. He had spent his last days in agony, waiting for an operation that never came. He had died alone, feeling like he had been forgotten by everyone. The nurse believed his spirit was still bound to the wheelchair, unable to find peace. I decided I needed to do something to try and free the patient's spirit. I spoke to a local priest and asked him to come to the hospital to bless the wheelchair. The priest agreed, and one evening we met in the old wing. The atmosphere was tense, and the presence of the wheelchair seemed even more oppressive than usual. The priest began to pray, sprinkling holy water over the chair. I felt a change in the air, a sense of calm that slowly replaced the eerie cold. However, just as I was beginning to feel the ritual was working, the wheelchair moved again, this time with a violent force causing the priest to step back. Fear gripped me as the chair rocked back and forth, as if an invisible force was shaking it. The priest continued praying, his voice shaking, but the chair would not stop. Finally, the priest stopped praying and looked at me, his face pale. "I can't do anything else," he said in a low voice. "This spirit is too tied to this place. It will need more than my prayers to find peace." After that night, I realized there was no easy solution to the wheelchair problem. I tried to continue with my job, but each night in the old wing became more terrifying. The noises, the movements, and the constant feeling of being watched became more intense. I knew I couldn't go on like this. A few months later, I decided to quit my job at the hospital. The constant fear and lack of sleep were affecting my mental and physical health. I found a new job in a smaller clinic, far away from the old hospital and its dark secrets. However, even now, far away from that place, I can't forget what I experienced. The images of the wheelchair moving by itself, the sounds, and the feeling of a constant presence continue to haunt me. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, I think I hear the squeak of a wheelchair in the distance, and I wonder if I'll ever be able to really escape from the shadow of the hospital.